really moved by the work that the state, the NAACP here in the state of North Carolina does. The fact that it is the largest branch of the NAACP in the South and the third largest nationally. And mind you, we're celebrating 65 years. The monumental, extraordinary victory of the same-day registration, early voting, with having the only state in the South with that to record as one of its victories. Also, the bridging of the gap between the brown and the black community. Its agenda of activism is one to be admired by all. Its work with unions, its work with youth and young people, its programs, its advocacy are extraordinary examples in a time when we need them more than ever. So I want to just acknowledge that as I begin my own remarks. I tend to think about my own life as one in which there have been extraordinary opportunities. And certainly those opportunities are opportunities that have come as a result of the work that men and women, ordinary people, do in advocating and shifting the paradigm and struggle and working every day and doing the things that often aren't celebrated and acknowledged. I remember as a child, part of my moral conditioning from my mother, who was born not too far from here in Jefferson County, Louisville, Georgia, was that she would be eternally grateful for her mother and father because she did not have to pick cotton in September. She went to school in September. So I can say in some ways, unequivocally, that I stand here because my mother did not pick cotton in September. By way of going to school, she ended up graduating the first in her community and her family from Payne College in Augusta, Georgia in 1942. She migrated from there to New York after teaching 1 year of high school in Rennes. Met my father who had come from the Midwest and was enlisted in the armed forces. They met, went on a date, decided that they were destined to be with each other. And upon my father's release from the armed forces in Oakland, California, decided to stay and settle in San Francisco, where I was born and raised 62 years ago. Often we're able to look at our own personal life, and in digesting our personal life, we're able to understand not only what is personally happening to us and our family, but in a much larger context, a more collective movement of people. As I spoke about my mother graduating from college in 1942, her grandmother, her father's mother, was born in 1853. She was freed by the Emancipation Proclamation. And born in 1853, she lived until she was 97 years old. She had an opportunity to hold me as a young baby in her arms. She was a healer. My mother's mother was a midwife. And so there's a way in which something extraordinary happened as my grandmother, and I can only imagine this, witnessed my mother and her grandmother and my great-grandmother, witnessed my mother graduate from the university in the college in Augusta in 1942. It's in watching this history as I slowly invoke an idea, we are able to kind of transpose that history and understand that history as we move forward in the future. Both my parents were employees of the United States Postal Service, coming to the post office when the federal government desegregated the federal workplace in 1947. They came in 1948. Another step in this long journey of people destined in their struggle for justice. My parents became involved in their union, the National Alliance of Postal Employees. I remember that well as a child growing up. They became involved in their union. They assumed another relationship and dynamic in terms of citizenship. Both my parents were lifelong members of the NAACP. My mother, at the time of her passing in 1983, was the local president of the National Council of Negro Women. So as we move this, we see that I, as a child, at 9 years old, witnessed via the television. This is when television had some meat to it, some importance, some relevance to it. I witnessed people moving in the Montgomery bus boycott. I decided that in my life, I wanted to emulate those people I saw. I wanted to be like them. I not only saw a vision, what I saw as a child, but I also saw that interpreted surreptitiously through my parents' eyes as well, as two young couples saw themselves being immersed in a struggle, in a movement that had breadth not only as is constituted at that particular moment, but a movement that had history behind it, whether it was from the abolitionist movement to the emancipation, through Reconstruction, through Plessy versus Ferguson in 1896, through, as I am a filmmaker as well, through the experience and birth of a nation and the lynchings that followed and the reinvigoration of the Klan that followed. Through all that, through the anti-lynching campaign of 1946, co-chaired by Albert Einstein and Paul Robeson, through all of that, through this period as I come into my own adulthood. I was a beneficiary of that. Being a baby boomer, I was born at a time when there was more money spent on infrastructure, more schools built than any time in this country's history. I watched that, witnessed that, and became a recipient of the benefits of that. The struggles, the ongoing struggles that men and women wage, workers and communities wage in the struggle for justice. In 1960, I was able, at 14 years old, to attach myself to a group of young people right out of here in North Carolina, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. Young men and women who weren't that much older than I was, but who were making a statement, finding their place not only in history, but finding their place in a movement. They themselves saw themselves as a continuum, part of a continuum, as we all are a part of a continuum of struggle for justice, economic justice, social justice, peace, these men and women became my heroes, people I want to be. As I went to college at San Francisco State College in 1967 and began to shape my own ideas, certainly they were influenced by not only my own struggle here, my own continuum of understanding of that history, but also the struggles that were waged around the world, the independence of African nations. Nigeria, Ghana, 1957. Kenya, 1963. We go on and on and on. Tanzania, we go on and on and on as we watch not only this struggle which symbolized our own history become magnified in some way beyond our borders. No one knows that Kwame Nkrumah went to Lincoln University, the first president of Ghana. That's no mistake. Also, that Ho Chi Minh washed dishes in Harlem. So these national struggles for liberation became part of a much larger definition of our own struggles, an expanded sense of what we mean by democracy and the body politics. That is the legacy we wear. Let us not forget this. This is the legacy we must pass down to our children as we march through this next phase of history. We are the bearers of that, the holders of that legacy. Dr. King, in his last moments, realized that there's something else that's happening that we had missed during the civil rights movement. Jeremy Rifkin, in his book, The End of Work, realized that although the civil rights movement dealt with the issues around de jure segregation, it did not deal with the issues around technology and the impact it would have on jobs. Technology, as capitalists do, invest their money in technology. That means they eliminate labor. Did not realize the impact that would have on jobs. In fact, he made a very profound statement in saying that it was not the emancipation that freed black people, but the cotton picking machine invented in 1944. It may sound funny, but in 1944, 100% of the cotton was picked by hand. By 1970, 100% was picked by machine, eliminating and moving 5 million people out of the South to the North to find work, to survive, to sell their labor in some sort of other way. We remember these things as we go through and understand where we are now, where we're positioned now. We've been all certainly caught up in what has happened in this extraordinary and historic election. The possibility that through a campaign we can have a change, but certainly we must all understand that not only that change must also represent the truth. The truth. We're in need of the truth about what is happening to us. We're in need of the truth that is what is happening to us as more than 50% of the prison incarceration is African American. We're in need of the truth when we have the highest incarceration rate per capita of any country in the world. We are in need of the truth when we realize that more than 50 million Americans are without health care. We are in need of the truth. We are in need of the truth when we realize that our kids, our children, 67% of our children in school are reading below grade level. We are in need of the truth. We are in need of the truth. And the truth is not simply a campaign. The truth has to be a movement. The truth must take the tenets of our past, the examples of our past, the understanding and collaboration of our past, and understand that we can only engage ourselves or realize that truth by action. By action, not simply voting, but being in part of the body politics. Not simply voting, but being at those meetings where decisions are making. By simply voting, but being at the place where those decisions are being made. We're in need of the truth. Since I'm trained as an economist, and I worked for 6 years in the Office of Community Development in the Model Cities program in the early 70s, before I decided to go another way. I'm always taken by these issues, which we're not supposed to know about. We have experts that tell us about us. We have experts that tell us about why we need a $700 billion bailout. We have experts that tell us about that. And interestingly enough, Michael Hudson, who is the president of the Institute for the Study of Long-Term Economic Trends, says that not one penny, not one single penny that will go to actual debt. That money would go to bail out who? The creditors. Now that sounds a lot like me about what happened in Brazil. Remember a few years ago? Or what happened in Mexico a few years ago, where the creditors were relieved of their anxiety and pain, but not the people. Now, it's very interesting because on the one hand, as we look at this information, we realize that 40% of Americans' income goes toward rent. We spend that now on rent. Another 15 to 20% goes in the payment of interest. That's 60% of our income already gone. Our disposable income now. So now, if we look at, it doesn't take a rocket scientist that even if we were prepared to have some difference in revitalizing our economy, how many people could participate in it right now, given the fact that very few of those people would be credit worthy at the bank to get loans or to get credit? It doesn't take us to tell you that. Robert Wright, the Clinton administration's Labor Department, in an op-ed in February, around the week of February 11th this year, said there are interestingly 4 things that brought us to this place if we look at over the last 35 years. He says, first of all, over the last 35 years, that the majority of wealth has gone to the top 5% of the population. And at that same time, the mean income for the average American worker has been stagnant for that 35 years. Now, we know what that means, that what you were able to buy 35 years ago, you can't buy now if your income has remained the same. So, how has the average American worker dealt with that dilemma? First of all, he says that women 35 years ago with child represented 35% of the workforce. Now, they represent 70% of the workforce. Now, I'm interested, 35 years ago, a lot of things have happened in there, you know, and I know there's a lot of fast food people and everything else, but isn't fast food interesting? Because that means it frees up time for women to work, or people with households to find a way. You all know that story. You know what? So the fast food is interesting. So the fast food industry has grown as a result of this. Just mind you, just look at this. So 70%, that's the second thing. The third thing is that the average American worker works 250 hours a year more than the average European worker. Okay, what has happened with that? So we've maxed out. More women can't with child come into the workforce. 2, you can't work any more hours after you're working 250 more. And the fourth thing is that in order to fill the gap, what we've done is we've leveraged our homes and the credit card. Now, 35 years ago, how many of you had a credit card? Who were 35? Very few of us had a credit card. So this credit card phenomenon is a new phenomenon. If we look at this in terms of that, we understand why 40% of our income goes to rent, or, as you say, house notes, whatever, and 15 to 20% goes to interest. So we're understanding something else. How does he say we at least attempt to get out of this? His suggestions are several. That the federal government increase the amount of money for families that in terms of tax, the write-offs for families, by increase that significantly. And the other suggestion is that they support the unions. They support unions. That was his suggestion. They support unions, particularly service industry unions, because you can't outsource those jobs. Those jobs can't move overseas, you know what I'm saying? So you have some way of understanding that what he says is that really the American worker has not benefited substantially for the increased amount of wealth that's being created in this country. Now, all of these things are we going to have to deal with in this new presidency. All of these things are we going to have to understand as we embark on this new historic journey. As I said before, we learn from past history. We take that history and use that history as a defining point, a defining moment in what we need to do in the future. So this campaign and this election, and God willing it happens, cannot be symbolic. That's right. It cannot be symbolic. It must be a movement for real change. How do we define quality education as a civil right? How do we define health care as a right, not a privilege? How do we define fair housing? How do we define keeping our senior citizens, those who I'm entering and those who are much older, how do we define a society which welcomes them? Those are the stories that we have to define and look at as we embark on this new history. And we will embark on this new history. We will make this journey. Dr. King liked to give, in one of his sermons, when he talked about Rip Van Winkle. I don't know if any of you have heard that sermon, Rip Van Winkle. When Rip Van Winkle goes up to the mountains, go to sleep, and he passes by a little inn, and that little inn represents what we would call a bed and bricks breakfast inn. And it has a picture, an engraving of King George V, King of England at that time. He goes to sleep. He comes back down, and he looks at the same inn, and there's a picture of George Washington when he comes back down. Now, he says, and who is that? Who is that? He did not know that he had slept through this phenomenal change in history. He has slept through it. We cannot be asleep. We cannot be asleep at the helm. We cannot be asleep at this helm. We must not be asleep at this helm. I've known rivers. I've known ancient, dusty rivers. We've known rivers. We've known ancient, dusty rivers. And our souls have grown like the rivers. We must use this moment. We must teach our children well. We must tell them that they are the embodiment of this future. We must tell them that they are the embodiment of this incredible history that we're about to make. But we are the ones who are going to have to make that history. And I know right here in Raleigh, North Carolina, that you will not be asleep. Thank you.